Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Robbins, SIP Forum President and Managing Director. I want to welcome everybody back to the Stir Shaken Enterprise Summit. This is our final webinar of the webinar series this week. And we're going to be talking about from design to deployment. This is the one element we can't get wrong. It's being presented today by Sarah Delphey, who's VP of Trust Solutions at Numerical. Hey, Sarah.
Hi, Mark.
We've also got Pierce Gorman, who's distinguished member of the technical staff at Numerical. Hey, Pierce.
Hi, Mark. Nice to see you.
And finally, we've got Frank Pettinato, who's CEO at Avantive Solutions. Frank, welcome.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me, Mark.
Our pleasure here. I'm going to disappear, and the stage is all yours.
Awesome.
Perfect. Thanks everybody for joining. I know being the last session, folks are eager to close things out for the week, so appreciate all of you guys for joining. Start by giving an overview sort of what we're going to be talking about today. I think there's been a lot of discussion throughout the week about KYC, this know your customer principle, identity of calling parties, and what we can do with that identity. And our goal really today is to pull all of those elements together and talk about them perhaps in a little bit more detail as compared to some others, and hopefully present some thoughts and opinions that you haven't heard previously throughout this week. So I'm going to kick us off by talking a little bit about just KYC in general. What does it mean? We've talked a lot about how companies, service providers should be vetting their customers. How are we going to do vetting? But I haven't really seen an in-depth discussion of what that actually means and how a service provider would perform that. So I'm going to take through a couple slides here. Hopefully this, okay, back here. So what is KYC? We've heard this term. There's a bunch of different definitions for it, but I'm going to propose to define it here and call KYC. This is kind of the overarching set of processes and policies. It's the approach that's used by a communication service provider, or CSP as we have it here, to evaluate the identity and the intent of the customers that are on its platform, not just at the outset, but from start to finish throughout the entirety of the customer life cycle. And why do this? Why do we care? So the goal is to evaluate that risk level that customer might represent so that a CSP can apply the right treatment to that customer's account and traffic, sufficient that it can mitigate those risks that it cares the most about, and also comply with laws, rules, regulations that it's subject to. I'm also going to talk a little bit about customer due diligence. Customer due diligence is, you see here, sort of subsumed underneath the umbrella of KYC. And when I talk about customer due diligence, I'm talking about those specific processes and procedures that are performed by that CSP, that service provider, to know that identity, evaluate that information, and evaluate risk. So whole thing KYC, and within that, as a service provider, each of those actions and touch points that you're having with that customer are going to be customer due diligence actions that you're using to try and identify. Okay, so slide advance there. So why do this? Why do we care? Talked a lot about people should be doing it, but why? What's in it for me? So we know those risks. If you don't perform good KYC, you could be subject to enforcement, litigation, potential reputation loss, which we've talked about, could have actual monetary impacts for you and your business. There's also fraud losses. If you don't understand who your customers are, perhaps they leave your network, they don't pay the bill, and you're left with bad debt as a result. I should say I've seen a lot of these. I ran a KYC team for a major carrier prior to coming to Numerical. So these are real world examples that I've seen with these. The thing that I don't think we talk about enough is the benefits, right? in addition to doing this out of fear, why should we do it for the benefit of our business? And I've seen KYC in my experience increase operational effectiveness when I understand who my customer is and what they want from me. I do a much better job of supporting that customer and ensuring I'm not doing things like mis-selling or putting them on the wrong contract, or not identifying perhaps an opportunity to upsell that customer or do other things that actually are in my general business interest. When you know things about your customers, you as a service provider have a much better understanding of your entire business and customer portfolio. I think a lot of times I've seen service provider leadership struggle to articulate it with real data. What industries are my customers in? What are the sizes of my customers? Where are they located? Some of these things, if you don't have solid validation and data recording processes, you don't have some of that key information that could be really useful to you as a leader. And then, of course, what we're going to be talking about here in addition is how can we use that trusted identity information, if it's validated well, in the pathway of a call to enhance consumer trust and open up these new business opportunities and for myself and my enterprise customers as well. So this all sounds great, but what do I actually do? How do I do this? You keep talking about this KYC thing. What is it? So we have, and I'm going to go through a little bit here, but just know we do have a handout that's attached, not just of these slides, but to a longer form document that goes into this in a little bit of depth. And then for those who really, truly care and who want to go into it, in that handout, there will be a link to a location on the Numerical website where you can download the full version of a KYC guide that I produced along with my colleagues that goes through in great detail, how could you create this process, or if you have one, optimize due diligence and KYC processes within your service provider organization. I think it's also a really good resource for enterprises to kind of understand, why is my service provider asking me these questions, and what should I know about what my service provider's intentions are, or, how do I judge when I'm working with a service provider that has a good KYC program? So shouting that out here. This won't be fully in depth, but I'm going to go through it in a little bit. So you're going to want to start with your leadership, right? I think a lot of folks may assign something to a particular member within their organization without stopping to think about why they're creating the program and what they want it to do. It should be something that's based on your risk priorities, which are going to be different from your peers. This is not a one-size-fits-all thing. You're going to want to set your own priorities, your own criteria for, okay, what do I want to know the most about my customers that is the most accurate predictor of risk associated with my customers. The other thing to keep in mind is it's a risk management program. It's not a risk elimination program. If your goal is to work your risk and fraud teams out of a job such that they will not exist anymore, you're not going to succeed, right? What we're doing here is not eliminating every single bad phone call, potential fraud that could ever exist on our networks. What we're doing is we're managing and understanding how much of that exists and what are the identities are of our customers, so we can reduce some of that, but also learn from it, right? Once this is set up and you have it, you can put events in context, you can now understand, okay, what else do I need to do to enhance what I have, or conclude everything was operating as normal. This was an aberrant event. I don't need to make any changes. I can continue from here. For example, if you are a service provider that works with medical offices, just to make appointment reminder calls in a very narrow set of circumstances, you're going to have a very different set of risk priorities and a very different KYC program to a service provider that supports telemarketing dialers, for example. You may not ask all of those medical offices what their intentions are for use of your services, because it's self-evident what they would want to do with your service, because it only does a limited set of things as it applies to those medical office patients. So This, unfortunately, we can't come up with a set that works for every single service provider, which is why coming at it from this approach of a risk-based assessment is so key. And last point here is it's so important to align that entire business around those KYC goals, not just a set risk management team, but your sales teams, your customer service teams, and make sure everyone shares responsibility for achieving these goals to make sure there's no conflict that arises between those groups. This is a high-level overview of what that process could look like. So for example, during a customer onboarding process, you're going to gather that information, you're going to verify and authenticate that either through internal sources, linking to third-party databases, using a vendor, etc. Once you have that information, evaluate, assess risk based on the risk framework that you have created, and apply your own rating or category of risk for that customer. That is going to tell you what needs to happen next from there in terms of, are there restrictions we want to apply to this customer for what products and service they can access? Do we want to do more frequent monitoring on this customer? Do we want to do some, enhanced due diligence on this customer, ask additional questions, go through another qualification process or a higher level of review prior to them coming on to our networks? And that continuous monitoring can look like a few things. We go into more depth in this in some of the materials that we're providing to you in the handouts and online, so you can take a look at that if you want to. But it's really about, doing that monitoring and customizing it to your circumstances and your customers. And this is the question I get all the time. Okay, great. As you still haven't told me, what do I actually need to review? So I want to answer this question for folks. So at a minimum, you need to be, these are basic things that anybody's going to need to do. If you're working with a business customer, you need to validate their identity sufficient to ensure that you're making a valid contract with somebody. So you need to know their business registration information, their name. This is where, third-party data sources can be really helpful. Frameworks like Life can be really helpful in making that process easier. And you need to review sufficient to know, is the person that you're talking to actually associated with the business that they're saying that they represent? Need to know, what is the nature of their business? What do they do? What services do they offer? What is their relationship to you? Most importantly, is this customer going to be using services directly, or are they going to be operating as a reseller, or are they a service provider of their own? And last but not least, in addition to those fact-based pieces of information, review the behaviors that they've had up to that point. And do any of those behaviors exhibit potential red flags, including things like, pushy practices, not wanting to disclose certain information, that kind of thing. At a minimum, service providers should be looking at these in order to even be able to do that next set of understanding, okay, who is my customer? Am I making a valid contract? And what else do I need to ask or review as part of my due diligence process? So it's a high level review, but I want to bring my fellow panelists in. I work on the operations side, and I'm really looking to a lot of the information they have here on, once we have that information about our validated customers, how can we use that to accomplish our goals of increasing trust and communications? So I'm going to stop showing my screen here. Perfect. And that to Pierce. Any thoughts on that topic?
Oh my goodness.
I
Well,
know you
so
got a
many
lot.
thoughts as you're going through that. So many thoughts. This is what always happens. So for people who don't know, my background was telecommunications, worked for Sprint and T-Mobile, and the last few years working on call authentication. So I'm going to bore folks maybe they'll find this interesting, talking about how identity information is associated with calling. How do we transmit information that helps the called party feel confident and have trust in the session that they're about to, the call they're about to, answer, we hope, right? And so back when things were first getting going, being able to get even the calling number was helpful information when people first started experiencing robocalls, what I guess would be like 20 years ago or now. And then an additional piece of information that became handy was calling names. So if you had that would be really good. But if you look at the information that Sarah was just going over, you saw what I call trust attributes, pieces of information that tell you something about the identity that's calling and whether or not that means that they should be a trustworthy person or company that you can answer the call for. So the way that we've started with this in the call authentication standards and regulation was to try and establish I'll call it a trust relationship between the originating service provider, not even the caller, the originating service provider, and then the terminating service provider. Whereas what Sarah was going over is the full end-to-end view, right? And for that full end-to-end view, we need the know your customer and customer due diligence policies and procedures to have the information so that we can gather those trust attributes, and then we can add that to the call signaling that's being done for STIR/SHAKEN. So for STIR/SHAKEN, the trust attributes are the calling telephone number and then some sort of an attestation from the originating service provider that says to the terminating service provider, not even the called party, here's what I as an originating service provider know about the number that's in this call that I'm sending to you. And so there's this levels of attestation, A level attestation, B level attestation, and then C. A is full. This is my customer. I'm connected to them. I know that they're supposed to use this number. Feel good. Take it. Now I'll stop there and mention that there's people that are tracking what's going on with the call signatures that are being applied. We're partway through this journey. For folks that don't know, larger service providers had to implement this call authentication technology on June 30th of last year. And there's an additional wave that got added here this year for non-facilities based voice service providers. And then next year, we're supposed to pick up the remaining TDM and small rural service providers, anybody with less than 100,000 subscribers. Now that depends on whether or not any of those rules get changed. The FCC is always evaluating things. They're constantly deciding whether or not they would let that waiver go further or whether it would come in. But so back to the trust attributes and the know your customer and this end-to-end journey. Sarah and I were in Washington, D.C. yesterday for a team meeting, and it occurred to me earlier today as we were, so I was thinking about that experience of coming back, and I had to go through, the airport security. And when I got to the place where I had to, give some sort of trust attribute to the Transportation Safety Administration agent, they didn't ask me what my telephone number was. And but they did ask for a little card, and it had either a card or my passport, right? So they wanted to see some sort of qualifying information that said, yes, Pierce is trustworthy and we should let him get onto this plane. In my case, I had a real ID. I'd have a Missouri driver's license, and there was extra stuff that I had to do so that Missouri said, okay, well, not only will we certify that you're licensed to drive a car, but that also that you're a Missouri resident, and we have the information to know that you're a U.S. citizen and a Missouri resident, and you also are able to drive a car. And mine also says I'm allowed to drive a motorcycle. I'm not sure how wise that is. I did break my leg a few years ago, but anyway, it's not really a trust attribute. Maybe it is, car, driver's license, and a motorcycle's driver's license. If I had a CDL license, I think that would be a trust attribute. So what Sarah talked about that gets me excited about call authentication is this idea that we won't just rely on the telephone number in the future, and it won't just be the service providers saying, hey, here's what I know about the number, and oh, by the way, if you look at statistics, you might find that some people are saying it's an A-level attestation when it really should have been a C, or maybe even blocked at origination because it was an illegal robocaller. So I'm excited about the future of communications insofar as we're able to match trust attributes, and we have to have respect for privacy. So the trust attributes that are being collected as part of the know your customer and customer due diligence, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to expose all that detailed, sometimes proprietary information that you don't want shared, even though it's your customer and you're trying to call them. So there could be ways of making sure that the information is trustworthy, even if it isn't just an outright, here's the reason why it's trustworthy, and you use what's called a trusted third party. And the trusted third party is an old concept within secure communications and in authentication and verification, and you use it every day, you don't even think about it. But when you go onto the web and you want to look at your bank account or something like that, you'll see a little green lock, up in the browser window. That happened because of some cryptographic signing and verification that occurred, certificates that were stored on your computer and that were evaluated during the establishment of that session with your bank. There was and the way that happens is the trusted third party is called a certification authority. So when the bank wanted to be able to provide that online service, they went to a certification authority and said, listen, we want to be able to have certificates that people can use to know that when they're connecting online, they're connecting to us and not anybody else. And so the certification authority says, we'll help you out with that. We're going to give you some you give us a request for a certificate, you include a signature that you put on the certificate so that we know that it's you, and we'll have done some other back office things. And then when we're satisfied with that, we'll issue you a certificate, and people will know that it's trustworthy because we, as a trusted third party, told them that what you're doing is trustworthy. And that's what's supposed to happen. It is what happens in stir, shake, and call authentication. And that certification authority framework is something that was put in place by the Secure Telephone Identity Governance Authority before we launched Stir Shaken as an industry regulated thing last year. And so there's this triangle of trust that occurs between certification authorities that are issuing certificates, and then this thing called the policy administrator, who tells the certification authority whether or not they can trust somebody, and then the trusted party, which is the service provider. So how this triangle works is the service provider says, hey, I'm going to register with the policy administrator. I need some certificates. I'm required by law and regulation to do this. May I have my certificates? And the policy administrator says, let's register you. Let's do some KYC and CDD, know your customer and customer due diligence. Are you an authentic service provider? Do I have the information that I need to be able to trust you? They collect that information, they make a judgment, and they issue them a cryptographic signature that says, yes, okay, you are a registered service provider and here is your token. Now then the service provider goes to the certification authority and says, hey, I need a certificate, I need to sign my calls, people need to know I'm adding to the trust of the system. Certification authority looks at the token that was given to them by the policy administrator. So you have this three-way checking to make sure that the information is valid and all the rest of that. So, and then calls get authenticated and they get verified. Well, that's great. So now we've got trusted communications, between the originating service provider and the terminating service provider. But did we take care of the end-to-end? Is the person who's calling or the enterprise that's calling, have they been able to get much value out of what happened there between those service providers? And my answer would be not very much. But with this work that's going on with KYC and with customer due diligence, this capture of the trust attributes, then there is there's a thing that we've talked about during this week. People have listened to any of my podcast or heard me talk about rich call data. There are signature types that are designed to go end to end. And so when we came up with the title for this webinar, it was to emphasize how critically important it is to have the information about the identity, that it is a real identity, and then the attributes associated with that identity, and then signal that. And we're at the very beginning of this journey. The ink's not even dry on the RCD standard. So, this is you're getting a preview, and then another year or so, we'll start seeing the fruits of the labor. I had a couple of other notes here that I made for myself. So I want to make sure that I covered what I needed. So I've covered pretty much everything that I cared about. I will say that one of the things that makes this difficult about how we're doing stir shake and then where we're moving with RCD and some of the trust the trust attribute that's associated with RCD is this telephone number. And you know, Chris Wendt and others that have, you know, that I've worked with over the years know that I am pretty dissatisfied with a telephone number or a list of telephone numbers as a source of identity, and certainly as a trust attribute. You know, they're ephemeral, and the provenance can be very difficult to establish, even for the customer, even for the people making the call, because, you know, up until recently, it hasn't been a thing that they've needed to care about very much. Service providers said, oh, you need a telephone number, here's some telephone numbers. And somebody who's making lots of calls might have two different people they're connected to for either low distribution, least cost routing, failure recovery, you know, redundancy, that sort of thing. And they may have gotten a bunch of telephone numbers, and one group might be using telephone numbers from a service provider they're sending calls to. Another group might not. They might have gotten them from somebody else, but still sending numbers down that call. So, you know, do companies spend a lot of time being really careful about, well, where did I get my numbers from? And where did the people that I got the numbers from, where did they get them from? It's not available. And I shouldn't say not available. I'll just say it is commonly difficult to establish.
Not
And so
known, yeah.
trying to tie the trust back to that is something that I don't think is going to, it isn't good enough. And so what the industry is doing with RCD and delegate certificates is critically important, but it all starts with the KYC and the customer due diligence. Now, I don't know if I've left any of the 90 minutes for Frank to have anything to say about this, but
Yeah, so
yeah.
I'll jump in there. So for context, so we're a call center, and a large portion of our business is outbound calling. So we work with Pierce and Sarah on a lot of initiatives to ensure that our calls get delivered. And there's a lot of sensitivity as these regulatory environments change on, you know, is a phone number an entity? So we have our clients, our customers are entities, and they have brands. And the prior express written consent is to the entity or a brand. So a lot of the regulatory environment here is talking about assigning a phone number. And that adds a lot of kind of, and we've got tens of thousands of phone numbers, you know, across multiple different clients. So it ends up being a bit of an interesting dilemma where we are now managing phone numbers versus the ability for an enterprise to sign a certificate using the RCD passport or the delegate certificate concept that we're going to kind of chat about today. So I'm a big proponent of let's bring this back to the originating entity or brand and deliver that certification to the recipient, who in fact was the one who gave the prior express written consent to the brand, not necessarily any specific phone number. So that's a philosophy we operate under. We believe it adds a lot of elegance to the solution. It keeps it a bit more simple. And any third-party certificate company or anybody who's certifying that can more easily say, hey, brand, here is your certificate. You know, what phone numbers you use, just make sure that that's part of the packets that you're sending out to the intermediate carriers, so they know that that phone number is now carrying your certificate. But it really needs to be kind of focused on the brand. You know, Stir Shaken has a lot of fundamental elements that's tracking and tracing these phone numbers, which I think is an awesome place to start. But we need to stay focused on the ultimate solution, which is an entity or brand who has prior express written consent by a consumer can in fact send that traffic all the way through with some level of knowledge and comfort that both parties are being respected in their intent, the intent of the recipient to get a call and the intent of the brand or an entity to deliver a call. So you know, Pierce, what, you know, does that kind of make sense to you, or what's your thoughts on that?
Oh my gosh. Yes, you said, I think, twice as much as what I said in about 1/10 the number of words. So reminds me of a story about Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, and the guy that came before him that spoke for hours. And the Gettysburg Address is quite short, very, very meaningful and impactful. Yes, absolutely. Now I'm kind of interested that you brought up you know, the express written consent, because this is something that Sarah and I have talked about, whether or not that is a controversial trust attribute, because is using something like that does that pose a risk for the enterprise or the BPO? Have they claim some, I don't know if the risk would come, and this is something I don't quite understand the controversy on. Is it because they would claim, they should have had it right? Now, I suppose there could be administrative issues where you send the wrong written consent for customer A when you're calling customer B or that sort of thing. But
Yeah, I think that's
I do
one.
think it's a valid trust attribute, right? I mean, if you have it, you document it, it's digital, you should be able to do something with it. Sarah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I do want to make sure we have a lot to cover in the time, so I want to make sure we can get through it. We thought we had a lot of time with an hour and a half, but this is a really good topic. So no, you're good. We got a lot to cover. Mark, if you would not mind rolling poll number 1 for us.
All right, which of the following best describes the current branded calling marketplace? Is it mature and thriving, delivering great value and improving user experience? Is it complicated and disjointed, difficult to manage and monitor? Is it somewhere between A and B? Or is it a freaking Wild West show? We'll give folks about another 30 seconds to respond, and then we'll share the results.
Disappointed I can't vote.
Yeah, we don't want to skew the results here, so I don't know. Curious on the results.
Yep. And who's answering?
Yeah, I don't think we get to know who answers what. I think we are
No, that's
semi-anonymous
good.
here.
I just meant
So.
like more industry. Where are they at?
Just assure people, we're not going to be auditing your responses on these.
Okay, so 0% say it's mature and thriving. 22% say it's complicated and disjointed. 26% say somewhere between A and B. And 52% say it's a freaking Wild West show.
Wow. I think, we were having some fun on that last response, just to keep people awake and engaged for the sake of a Friday afternoon. But yeah, does that surprise folks? No? Yes?
No, not me.
Yeah, I was going to say, I am surprised, and, I'm the one who threw the D in there, the freaking Wild West show. And I was, I was kind of tired when I wrote it, and I was, kind of, I won't say loopy necessarily, but I was in a mood to be kind of, playful. So yeah, I don't know if I want to say anything more about the results other than I think that I thought it was really important that nobody, 0 respondents said that it was mature. And I agree with that. That's where it should have come out. And so the other responses are fine. And I think people were having fun too with the freaking Wild West show. Frank, do you want to comment on it before we?
Yeah, go ahead. I think particularly, Frank, I'd be really curious your thoughts on, why you think is specifically in the call center environment. Would love to hear your thoughts on your perspective on whether it's working well and whether identity changes. If we work on identity, how does that change those results, do you think?
Well, the Wild West show, I think concept comes from, despite a lot of communication, up to the wire, there, the carriers that we were working with, we're kind of struggling to explain all the details, and we have the need to understand all this because those calls that we make are very valuable to our clients and obviously to us, and they have to make it through. So we monitor all our data on traffic fairly closely, probably more so than most people think. So we do very sophisticated statistical analysis. We look at call answer rates by caller ID. We look at, we get information from the carriers on what's blocking. We work with numerical for reputation of those numbers. We also get reports back on what attestations our numbers get, and still a little bit of a mystery on how all that happens. So there is some kind of gap in understanding of exactly what's happening behind the curtain. But the goal hasn't changed, which is to initiate a call and have that call answered, and us actually speak to the recipient. What, as the standard gets rolled out to other carriers, perhaps this will kind of smooth out. But right now, I'd say it's quote working in the sense that it's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, but I'm not entirely sure I can measure the value other than perhaps some anxiety that's caused by monitoring the information that we're getting back. I think I still stand by my principle where entities and recipients should worry about the brand or the that's making the call, and the recipient knowing that that brand is in fact trying to contact them. And this kind of intermediate concept of phone numbers and all these different attributes are perhaps a good starting point. Not sure, Sarah, if I answered your question specifically, but that's kind of my sense of it. And to say it's a Wild West show doesn't, it makes sense to me, because anytime you're not entirely sure what the value of doing anything is, I think it breeds a lot of confusion, especially when it's a big distraction as well.
Yeah, I think it's helpful, and if others have comments or questions they want to share on that, feel free to. But I think that's right, and I really value your perspective in saying it's something we shouldn't forget is that it's about what is the value proposition. I mean, it's not free to do, and so if an enterprise is gonna seek to do branded calling, they need to be seeing results from it and being able to understand it. And I think you're right to say that we have more work to do both on the understanding of the value proposition and also the value proposition itself, right? What is it and why should I do it? There's more work to be done there.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead, Pierce.
Well, I had a really great thought and I've forgotten it because I'm old, but because it was off of something that Frank said. Oh, I remember because Frank said this before and I've been thinking about it when we were doing the prep, and he mentioned that they go to a lot of trouble to do a lot of analysis on the information that they're able to collect, and that is an area that I think is needs development. That there isn't necessarily good information coming back. The session that was earlier that was talking about 603 plus, and there was the argument about how 603 plus should be easier or better for the callers, the people who are getting that redress contact information back as compared to like a 607, 608. And I agree with that viewpoint, but that's only for like block calls. And then I think Tim Dwight from Verizon mentioned that maybe at some point that concept should be extended to when calls are labeled as well. And I won't spend much time on that. I'll just say quickly, that's harder, but I agree with him. And he knows that too. I didn't, but anyway, so this, the cost aspect, that's material. We're running businesses. The people are trying to make the calls, want to be able to make sure that they're getting the value for their effort. And there isn't really a feedback loop other than saying, well, I'm tracking my calls and it seems like more of them are getting through and less of them are getting blocked. And if we have 603 information, or we can get that, then they can say, oh, well, I can see that it wasn't blocked by analytics, or it was blocked by analytics, and I have something that I can go after to try and fix the problem and improve the performance. But I think we want to go even further than that. You don't want to just know when it was blocked. I think you also want to know when it was accepted and it was helpful to the called party. And something I've mentioned in like the podcast before too is this concept that maybe we should be thinking more about mutual authentication. So not just a signature coming from the calling party to the called party, but back. So make it a richer bi-directional experience. And where that would be particularly valuable is for like the healthcare industry or for the banking industry, where it's very important for the customer who's getting the call to be known to who they're calling, and then and vice versa. But on the cost thing, something that I was thinking about as we were talking about this, and I love that you've done that handout and you've done the deeper dive on what KYC, what know your customer and customer due diligence processes are and why they're valuable, the things that are, that could be harmful if you don't do them, and the things that are a benefit if you do them. And I was looking at, you know, it's just in my head, if we're talking about end-to-end communications, what are the things that we have to have happen? There's an information collection, there's an information documentation, and that documentation for call authentication is certificates. So that's something people aren't going to be very used to doing. And then you've got to be able to signal this information, and then you have to have somebody to verify it. And then it would be really good if after all of that work, somebody actually saw the result of all that front end work that happened. They're not, you know, not getting just a green check mark, but getting additional information that's meaningful to them. So as I think about back to the cost, you know, you mentioned in your slide you had an entry in there for the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, and you know that that's near and dear to my heart. I think that that's a fantastic free source of pre-qualified information, but it's for a fairly small segment of industries and companies so far. And it's a fairly strenuous process. It was put in place for the financial organizations originally because of the G20 summit back in from the 2008 financial crisis. So that's a great way to do that collection and documenting that I was talking about. But what can we do for the smaller service providers? And that comes back to what you had said about a risk-based analysis. So I think out of everything that we've talked about and about that freaking Wild West show, that I think the thing that's probably nearest and dearest to my heart is some way to make it less of a Wild West show, is to come up with a standardized process that could be applied by, I'll just call it registration authorities, for the enterprises that want to be able to use that enhanced calling service, so that it's not a surprise for everybody what it is that they have to do, and that it's appropriate to the scale of the company that needs to use those services.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it's, you know, when you talk about a risk-based approach, this isn't something that service providers, just for service providers, should be doing. This is something the industry should be doing, right? And so we shouldn't treat everybody the same, because otherwise, you know, we're going to price certain folks out of the market. We're going to block legitimate phone calls just because certain people aren't able to contribute, and we're going to harm consumers. And so we have to think about, you know, how can we apply different levels and standards to authentication to form that right balance between trust and burden on folks. So for example, you know, if you're a tiny service provider, you may not even think of yourself as a communication service provider. You might think of yourself as an IT managed service provider in your local community. And you know, I don't need to invest and know my customer. I walk into the physical buildings where my customers operate. I know that's a law firm. I know Steve who runs it. You know, I don't need to invest in what else do you want me to do? How can we ensure that the right, you know, strong level of trust is associated with that kind of a validation without being abused? And it's a tough problem, but I think we need to not stop there. I think we need to, you know, lean in and figure out, there are answers for this. There are ways to use tools to apply different levels of trust to different levels of communication. So yeah, and I know, Frank, you've got a lot of thoughts on this. You've worked with a lot of businesses.
Now, you know, it's interesting, Sarah, what I was contemplating is, you know, the service provider is and there's like a whole ecosystem, right? So you have the entity, the service provider, and then obviously the recipient. Each one of them has to trust each other throughout the process. But ultimately, the ultimate trust, I think, is the trust of the recipient that everyone upstream did what they were supposed to do, so that when they do in fact answer that phone call, it's a legitimate call, and that knowledge that it's legitimate actually helps that call be more effective, whether it is a telemarketing call or a medical appointment, or, you know, something related to the child, you know, your child's school. So, you know, the trust all the way up and down the ecosystem, I think, is resonating with me. And depending on where you sit in the ecosystem, you can look to your left and look to your right and figure out who, you know, who else do you need to trust, which supports kind of Pierce's concept of maybe this has to be synchronous versus asynchronous, and there are feedback loops along the way to validate that. So yeah, I mean, it's good stuff, guys. This is a great discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And I think
Thank you,
I would
Frank.
love to hear more from folks on, so, Pierce, you talked earlier about the full pathway of the call, right? Sir Shaken addresses this piece of the call, but there's this, so prior to the call being placed, there's this validation process that needs to happen that's not, it's not a technical solution inherently or fully. It's an operational, legal compliance solution that then pulls into a technical solution. And I'm we've talked a lot about, and folks have talked about enterprises and enterprises being able to self-assert their own identities, sign their own calls, et cetera. And this is an enterprise conference. If we're able to solve this, how does this help the enterprise as compared to, other solutions or just stir shaken signing by service providers, et cetera, as it may exist today?
So I think that was kind of directed to me. You covered,
Yeah.
and
Sure,
as
yeah.
usual, we're covering, covering a lot of ground. The let's see, what was the piece that you said that I thought was the one that I really wanted to speak about the most? The information that's available. Boy, there's so many things. I'm having
Yeah.
a tough time knowing where to start.
Let me jump
You want
in.
to jump in?
Yeah.
Yeah, do it.
So one of my famous sayings, is this a solution looking for a problem? And sometimes that feels that way, right? So the regulators in their infinite wisdom came down with this, and for a good reason, right? We get why this is done. But here we are after it's implemented, and we're like, wow, it sort of makes sense, but it doesn't get to the root of the issue. Where we're sitting down here as an industry, we have to, in the context of what Stir Shaken does now, I think it just further supports what problem are we legitimately trying to solve. This concept of trust, and we kind of touched on it. It goes up and down the ecosystem. There's, perhaps a belief and a need for synchronous ability, and it also brings us into a new world where we're including the real people who are footing the bill for this, right? The brands and the entities who are paying for this to go through the carrier. And we're respecting folks on the other end who either are receiving legitimate marketing calls or are in fact expecting a call because of prior express written consent. So there's a lot of constituents that we need to make sure that we're honoring the wishes of. And I just want to be careful, and oftentimes in these kind of new regulatory environments, that we don't overweight the solution and then start to say, well, this potentially can solve all these different problems, when I think it's best to just take a step back and say, what problem are we trying to solve? And can this technology be adapted, evolved, enhanced, to do that?
Okay. Thank you for jumping in, because you reminded me what I wanted to say, and it was based on this concept of spoofing. And I wanted to, watching the webinars this week, which I always love the SIP forum webinars, whether it was just dedicated to the technology or now that we're getting more interesting, I think, with the Enterprise Summit. There, and I've seen it even, I don't want to, name names or blame anybody, but I'm just going to say that I saw what I would call misinformation in one of the presentations this week. And the misrepresentation was that with Stir Shaken in place, we'll have solved number spoofing. And I really respected John Peterson's review of kind of the history of not just a little bit of the history of SIP, because this is 20 years since SIP RFC 3261 was completed, SIP version 2, the one that we all rely on. With this, and John Peterson, if just for a quick review for people who don't know, he is the original author of the SIP identity header that we use for putting a signature in the call to signal between service providers and eventually, between enterprises and their called customer, or at least to the terminating service provider of the called customer. And John observed that the identity header for Shaken in particular has the identity of the originating service provider, not the identity of the person that's calling. That identity hasn't changed at all in what we're doing with the signaling. That identity is still just the telephone number. And with respect to spoofing, the reason people thought that, or kind of had an idea that STIR/SHAKEN was going to combat spoofing or eliminate spoofing is because of this cryptographic thing about authentication and verification. So you often use cryptography to prevent what's called a man-in-the-middle attack. So you sign something, you send it across the network, and the terminating side looks at it, and they look at the information and they say, okay, I can tell that this information has been tampered with because the signature doesn't match what was put there by the person who authenticated the call. There's been a change to this information. It's not authentic. I know not to trust this. And with spoofing of telephone numbers, it doesn't really apply to STIR/SHAKEN because the spoofing of numbers, and spoofing's not illegal, right? It's used for a doctor calls his patient. He doesn't have his number in that call. The PBX that's supporting the doctor's office puts the the receptionist number in there, not to the doctor's office. So he's not getting all his patients calling, directly back to his mobile phone. So spoofing is legitimate, but the spoofing occurs at the very call origination before it ever even gets to the originating service provider, the one that's putting the signature on there. And as I said before, one of the things that's so difficult is to understand the provenance of the calling number. Did it belong there? Is it okay for it to be there? And did the service providers who are supposed to be checking for that even have the resources to check every single number for every subscriber to know for every call whether it should be there? And so the spoofing that we most worry about, my assumption is that it happens well before the call ever gets signed. And so the signature from the originating service provider is going to be signing a spoofed number, sometimes legitimately, sometimes illegitimately. And so the thing that I liked about what John Peterson said was that signature that we put in there really is just for the service provider. And yeah, we added some stuff on there, or SHAKEN added some stuff on there for the attestation, but it's not really the full end-to-end identity information that is possible, that's an embodiment of what John Peterson and Chris Quinn have been writing, but we're not there yet, right? And so there's still plenty of work to do.
Hey, Sarah, let me jump in. And Pierce, when Pierce, you were talking about spoofing, this is all about the trust, going out, and, we touched on it and we talked about rich call data, but specifically, call branding. We leverage that technology pretty heavily, and the goal there is just to give certainty to the recipient that brand that they're expecting a call to come through is actually happening. And in sales, it's about right time, right offer. So if we give a recipient the opportunity to make a decision to answer that call, perhaps it's the right time. And then obviously once the call is answered, if we give an attractive offer, it's a right offer. And I wanted to kind of share my thoughts on branded calling, if I may, and kind of maybe share some real life examples that we've seen over, at this point, tens of millions of calls. Contrary to popular belief, in a sales environment, that right time, right offer concept, we actually see a degradation in live answer rates. 10 to 20%, for example, if it was just a simple blind call. But what happens next is actually fascinating. Our total cost of a sale drops significantly, and the reason for it is a person that is perhaps predisposed to want to interact with that brand, right time, will pick up the call, and assuming the offer is right offer, then our conversion rates go up. And we measure that kind of two ways. One is something we call sales efficiency, which is first call close. So if I call somebody and the first time they pick up, I actually close a transaction, that is a very, very efficient interaction. In a branded calling environment, because they're recognizing which brand is calling them, they've made a decision to answer it, right time, and the offer is attractive to them, right offer, that sale actually happens. Further, just in general, our conversion rates are increasing fairly significantly. So I could give you just some kind of aggregate data. So we see live connect rates drop between 8 and 20%, depending on the brand. But our cost per sales actually drop between 4 and 14%. Our sales efficiency, which is our first call close, is actually increased by about 12%. And our conversion rates have actually increased up to 26%. These are staggering numbers. And it's a testament to the interest of a recipient to take that call because they trust that the brand who's calling them is in fact the right brand. But these happen outside of this whole ecosystem we just talked about, right? So there's a whole nother verification of the legitimacy of using a brand name, and in many cases, the brand's logo, such as some of the carriers, including Google, will allow us to present. Further supporting this concept that we touched on the delegate certificate, because I like to roll it all into one. So now I've got a brand is going to initiate a call. The brand is going to decide what name is going to go on that call, what logo, perhaps even a call reason. If that thing can be verified all the way through the network and delivered to a consumer, that is the ultimate level of trust. It's respectable. We're respecting the brand and the brand's wishes. And in many cases, right time, right offer, a consumer may be just tickled pink and delighted that that call came through. Or perhaps it's a necessary call, medical situation, or I always given the analogy of a pet recovery service that we have that, of course, people want to see the call coming through if they've in fact found their pet. So that, those are kind of things that I'm excited about on the prospects of using this technology. It goes back to my concept. This is literally the problem we're trying to solve. Now we need to take all this regulatory work and kind of pivot it and use it to solve the business problem.
Yeah, I think that's really great context to have sort of on the value, because I think some of us can question this idea of, if I am, what does that do for me as an enterprise if I'm more transparent, if my identity is transmitted through? And I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that these are business calculations that folks are making. So the data that you're talking about is incredibly important to understand. Yes, there's real value here for enterprises and being able to self-assert identity, just in addition to, connect rates as a separate thing. So with that value, I think I also want to talk about, how do we do it? There's been a lot of talk during this conference of, okay, from a technological perspective, if we have this identity, what's the best way to transmit it? And before I let you guys talk about that topic, Mark, could we roll poll number 2 on rich call data?
All right, the question is, what should branded calls which do not use RCD call authentication be permitted to display verified on the terminating device? Yes, no, or what is RCD? And we'll give folks about 30 seconds more to vote. %45 say yes, 47% say no, and 9%, interesting, say, what is RCD?
Yeah, that is interesting and very, we've got a very mixed set of results here, and a good significant portion not knowing what it is. Pierce, could you educate those that may not know what RCD is, and talk a little bit about what are some of our options that we have today for transmitting some of this sort of enhanced identity information if we were to be able to pull it together?
Yes, I do want to comment on the poll though about the yes and no's. And I was kind of surprised that there wasn't more what is RCD. So we have, I think, a fairly informed audience. Either that or they're just,
Pretending.
Didn't care, didn't answer. The typical survey. I kind of, this is like I was saying before, I was kind of curious. I'd love to know which part of the industry segment people that answered just particular ways, which ones they represented. So one of the things that I know that folks that I used to work with were very sensitive about was the use of the term verified with respect to calls, the information associated with the caller being displayed, right? And some felt that that should be almost regulated, right? That the FCC should maybe even issue a rule that says verified doesn't show up on that display unless the call was authenticated, meaning that there's a cryptographic call signature, either from the caller themselves or from the originating service provider, that was successfully verified at the terminating side of the call. And there were other folks that felt like, and I'm going to say mostly vendors, who said, well, no, I've got this out of band solution that doesn't even use RCD. I'm using all these sophisticated ways to get the brand information available at the terminal device that when that call comes through, you can be extremely confident that that was a legitimate call that happened when it was supposed to and was supposed to be displayed and can be called verified. And I think it's fair, that there can be arguments on both sides of that coin. But my own sentiment is no, I would like it if there was a rule that says, no, you don't get to say that unless you use call authentication. And maybe that's also because I want to promote the use of call authentication and specifically for RCD. Go ahead.
Pierce, before you keep going, I do want to add this comment from the audience that someone felt the question was confusing, and that if RCD is on top of the attestation level, then their answer would have been yes. So perhaps there could have been some confusion among the audience as well too, which is
top of attestation level. The answer is yes. Okay. Now I don't understand the question, but if they want to have a dialogue on it offline, I would love to explore this more. So I appreciate that they put that in there, and thank you. So for the folks that don't know what RCD is, which if you're paying attention here and looking at the poll, I'm going to say most people understand what RCD is, but we had a discussion in preparation for this where we talked about, well, when we talk about branded calling, or if we talk about RCD, are those things synonymous? And I think the answer is no, they're not synonymous, because branded calling means different things to different people. And for some people, it means nothing more than just a calling name that would be appearing. And even and calling name itself is another technology choice. We call it CNAM within the industry. And as Richard Shockey has observed, I think more than once during this week, that it's kind of a US and Canadian sort of thing. And it's interesting to see the differences in how CNAM is done even between the United States and Canada. So for instance, in the United States, there is a large registry that collects calling name information associated with telephone numbers, and then the terminating service provider has the option of dipping that database or dipping a copy of that database that might have been modified, or a database of databases, right? It's up to the terminating service provider what resource they want to use to look at to say, I've got the calling number, what is the calling name that goes with that? Whereas in Canada, what they do is they use the same, if it was all, let's say it was all TDM, there's no VoIP involved, because Canada is largely TDM, there is a generic name parameter, I believe is the name of it. Victoria's watching because I saw a question from her that we'll have to hit back later. And she's an SS7 and an ISUP expert, so that's why I had to be careful here. The generic name parameter. And it's not used in the United States, but it is used in Canada. And in Canada, the originating service provider will place that name into the signaling and send it in band to the terminating service provider, where it's read and rendered to the called party. That Canada example is more of how rich call data works, where the calling name, and as Frank mentioned, with RCD rich call data, you can package up additional information. And it's people who, if you haven't studied this, you should take a little time to look at it, because we talk about, well, it could be the name and the number and a logo and a reason for calling, and that's where we're all starting with this. But that signature and the references that it can refer to in terms of information about the caller is extremely rich. That's based on a virtual card, a V card standard that has many, many properties, and there's lots of information. So I can see where over time the rich call data could become very rich in terms of what happens between what you're told about the caller and what the called party is able to see. But to just quickly review on the branded calling. So some people think it's just the calling name. Some people, some industry folks have looked at what's called enhanced calling name, which has, which then kind of leads you a little bit more closer to the rich call data view of things. Longer name strings, perhaps logo and other. I don't know of anybody that's actually deployed or plans to deploy enhanced CNAM, but that is another branded calling technology. And then I think I've got messaging listed on here, which I think is interesting because I'm not sure why I had that there, but I will say that what we're doing with RCD and with branded calling can apply to more than one channel. It doesn't have to be just the voice channel. So over time, I would expect to see identity, trust attributes showing up in more, and possibly including non-traditional channels, right? So WhatsApp or TikTok. Goodness knows where it can all end up. But it's like what John Peterson talked about. He told how to package the information, how people choose to use it or apply it. That's for others to decide. I don't know,
Yeah,
did I cover the answer? I'm not sure.
I think you did. Yeah, for sure. And we running up a little bit higher. I want to make sure we have time for questions. We'll take it to a panel, but we did have a third poll question. How do we feel about, do we want to go to the third poll question or move to some closing thoughts here?
I think we have possibly time if you don't let me talk afterwards.
Yeah. All right. Pierce, your veto from time. I'm just kidding. Mark, we can do the last poll.
All right, the question is, have the free number registration portals been a good way to ensure calling numbers are not mislabeled or blocked? Yes, could be better, no, and finally, I have no idea what you're talking about. We'll give folks about another 30 seconds or so to vote.
I'm going to take the chance while the poll is running again in the interest of time. The reason why we're asking this question is because I think taking it back to the enterprise, certain enterprises, may or may not care necessarily about branded calling or adding that in, especially small businesses that don't have an issue. And I think one of the things I've learned talking to Frank is that a lot of enterprises may not even know that their calls are being blocked. They may not have that information. There's a lot of other reasons why that may not be, folks may not be aware of it. And so part of the reason we had this on here is we want to talk a little bit about, what that awareness is. And for folks that are on here, which are more informed, has that been successful, the registration and preventing calls from being blocked?
Thanks, Sarah. Well, we've got the results up. 4% say yes, 40% say could be better, 26% say no, and 30% say I have no idea what you're talking about.
Wow. That's surprising. Thoughts, feelings, team?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is, and perhaps now in retrospect, we probably should ask the question is, I don't have enough data because doing the free registration is a one-way street. I can register all my numbers. Unless I'm doing some statistical analysis on the back end and looking at blockage and so forth, I'm not entirely sure I know what, the actual cause and effect. But, I'll leave it to you, Sarah, if you want to talk, because it's probably closer to your business, what it is.
Yeah, so the free crawler registry, for those that don't know, you can Google it. It is a place, a web page that exists where you can input information for free that does go to the major call analytics providers. It doesn't provide the ability to get any kind of sort of ongoing monitoring or understanding. You submit the information and your experience may vary depending on the carrier that goes to or the company that goes to. And I know a lot of folks have been submitting through the portal, but we've also seen folks say, I've submitted it there, but I don't know what happens next. And so I think enterprises are really looking for additional solutions to be able to continue to manage and understand, okay, I did that. What impact is that having on my actual call outcomes? We're running up on time. I want to leave some time for questions. In terms of last things I wanted to cover, and then Pierce and Frank, I'd love to hear sort of last thoughts that you have. Just a quick reminder, the handouts that are on there for me, and in terms of the full guide for service providers on KYC, and the fact that if you go to the end of that, there will be a link to the long form version. I essentially wrote this with the idea of what would I have wanted to have 10 years ago before launching a KYC team and a service provider. So hopefully it's helpful. And if folks have any feedback on that or have thoughts on other things that they'd like to see or other materials, please reach out to me. I would love to know that. Pierce, any final thoughts?
Do I have any final thoughts? No, I am anxious to get to the comments I saw in there. I was being corrected by a person who apparently knows more about Canadian calling technology than I do. So I do like that kind of feedback. So, and I'm repeating what I've heard from others, and hearsay is not a good source. So it's kind of like, well, anyway, yeah, I was gonna say kind of like call authentication, but anyway.
Frank, any thoughts?
I mean, I've kind of, I'm sure the audience has picked up that I'm most interested in getting a call through from the brand to the recipient unabated, with a clear intent of either the brand or the reason why we're calling, because that's the business that we're in. So, I'm passionate about the RCD passport, the delegate certificate, and making sure that this is something I stay focused on and I invest my time and energy in, because ultimately it puts the power in, it basically solidifies that relationship between the brand and the recipient. And all the intermediate steps to get there from a regulatory environment need to kind of support the the purpose here, or the vision that we have to have trust in that phone call.
Okay, it's Frank's fault. I now have closing thoughts.
All right, quick closing thoughts.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of KYC and CDD and encoding that information and the trust attributes and making that available to the called party. This is something that we'll continue to work on, but I mentioned the triangle that exists for knowing the identity and being confident in it in terms of the certification authority, policy administrator, and the service providers. That exists to well establish the identity of the information that's in the certificate that's used to verify the call. For delegate certificates, that same triangle doesn't really exist. There ends up being this delegation chain where things can get, I'll just say, not entirely satisfactory for me, partly because it's focused on telephone numbers, partly because I think that terminating service providers or even the called party might like to know, is it the enterprise that's calling me? Is it an agent calling on behalf of the enterprise? And the information, so the information that's captured in the certificate and in the certificate chain is really just focused on telephone number provenance. So my final thought is that we as an industry should look hard at how we can improve the information that's available in those delegate certificates and in that. Now, I think the Rich Call Data Passport is brilliant work. But I think that the certificates and the certificate system that we're using to verify what's in those RCD passports, I think that needs work, and people should expect to hear more from us on that.
Perfect. Thank you, Pierce. I'm rolling through some of the questions. Please, we've got a few in here, but please add additional questions. We've got some time here to run through those. Apologies, we've chatted back and forth some in here, so hopefully I'm not skipping over anybody's question, but had a question here. What are your thoughts on alternate presentation numbers, specifically, in parentheses, specifically legal spoofing, and how to vet that the customer has the right to use the alternate callback number, particularly in the case of outgoing call centers who are calling on behalf of another business or several other businesses?
So Frank, do you want to answer before I go blah, blah,
I
blah?
mean, obviously that's what we do. So,
Mhm.
I'd say, Wild West probably was the case because there wasn't really anybody watching those numbers. I mean, especially when you start to get into tens of thousands of numbers, you could accidentally leave some in rotation that could be legitimately used by others. Now that we've had to register those numbers with STIR/SHAKEN, it's put a lot more controls in place from both the party who we purchased the numbers from, the carrier who's delivering the call on our part. But now, because that extra work needs to be done, we've put a lot of controls in place to make sure that we call it hygiene, right? So there's a lot of hygiene associated with those numbers. So I don't, honestly, there's probably no specific party that's regulating it, but by virtue of those controls that are in place because of STIR/SHAKEN, there's a lot of certainty right now that any third party that's calling on behalf of a brand and has basically secured numbers, the expectation is they are in fact monitored and measured all the way through. Another way of thinking about it too, there's probably a feedback mechanism where either, we haven't really touched on it, but call it like the crowdsourcing spam monitoring folks, or even the carrier themselves, if they get a high number of call rejections, those third-party analytics companies are going to probably get onto this number is probably not legitimately being used very quickly, and then ultimately those calls get blocked, which is a trigger to us that perhaps there's an issue. I'd say our hygiene is super high, but I could see how, others in our business who are probably not putting that level of effort could easily be misusing numbers. And ultimately, they pay the price because the third-party analytics companies typically find that out. So hopefully I've answered your question. Feel free to follow up if I haven't.
Sure. Go
Yeah.
ahead, Pierce.
Yeah. So Victoria Cook was a colleague of mine at Sprint and at T-Mobile, and I really appreciated her putting that question in there. And it was a good, meaty question. And so, Victoria, I don't know if you just wanted to know from the panel or if you wanted to know from me either, but you have my email address, so feel free to follow up on it if you would. When I saw the alternate presentation number, the APN claim that was in the RCD passport, what I immediately went to, what my immediate thought was thinking about how call authentication can be used internationally for places, and I specifically thought about the United Kingdom, where alternate presentation number is an actual, identified field within the call signaling. But I've learned, and you probably knew this, Victoria, and I'm sure Frank did, that that when calls come out from outbound call centers, a lot of times they'll have a different number in the sorry, I'm going to go geek on you guys, SIP, P asserted identity header as compared to what's in the from header. And so one of those might be considered an alternate presentation number, and that's where, using that in the RCD might make sense, or does make sense. But I think that the provenance of either of those numbers, maybe the number that's used to not be the calling number that's displayed to the user, so the opposite of that, whatever that would be, the alternate presentation number. Maybe that improves the security, but so I don't really know if I'm answering your question, Victoria, but that's what I thought about, was it would be used for that sort of thing. And as far as your part of the question where you asked about the provenance, I think it might be better, might be easier for that calling number that's not displayed, because it's used for business purposes. That might be easier to nail down that provenance. I don't know if it's as important as the other number. So that's all. Sorry.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I mean,
Sarah.
I would say, not to pile on too much, but I think 2 points I want to add to that. One is that it's obviously really important, right? We can't simply say, no, you're not allowed to use another number that isn't your phone number. It just there's so many use cases where, Pierce talked about the doctor's office example. There's plenty of cases in which it would be incredibly detrimental if we forced everybody to specifically put individual calling numbers that operate within a call center environment, let's say. It's a challenge, right? The service provider that's outposting that phone call is often not the service provider that is the number administrator for that phone number. So how do we put those two together? I think that the way that you do that is through consolidating phone numbers around an identity. And I think specifically in that outsourced call center example where you have, somebody is authorized to use a brand's phone number and they want to give that authorization to a third party. Well, if their identity is already associated with that number and somebody else tries to register that number, it should say, no, that's already associated with this brand. The brand would have to give you permission in order to use that phone number in a different context. And if the brand authorizes that outsourced call center to do so, they certainly can. Also in the example of, that doctor's office, if all of those phone numbers are consolidated around the single identity of the doctor's office, then it shouldn't be a concern if they're outpulsing any of those numbers that are under the control and operation of their brand, of their identity. So, there's no perfect way to solve for this. That's not going to ever, it's just like porting, there's a lot of things that have been done to ensure that the folks that are moving phone numbers and saying, hey, I'm porting this number to my new service provider is the person that's actually authorized to do that. It's not perfect, and it requires a whole system around it, but it is something that I think we can solve for to the satisfaction of those scenarios. Other questions here. I think we have a couple in here that are more perhaps comments than questions, and so those came back to if anybody wants to touch on some of those. Had a comment in here about Glyph extending LEI to the digital version, the VLEI, verifiable LEI, which can be passed through with RCD, and those trust attributes as well. Trust attributes like TN, logo, reason for calling can be cryptographically bound to the underlying VLEI and thus the enterprise itself. Appreciate that comment as well to expand on the use of LEI. Not really a question, but if anybody wants to comment on that.
Boy.
That may be we may need to follow up on that one, Pierce. That's
I was
a big
just going to
topic.
say, I'm not sure this is the best forum to try and touch on that. It's good.
Yeah.
It's good. I liked it. It was an interesting comment.
Yep.
There's
Yeah, we can follow up.
I said there's
on
a lot
that
more work to do. There's a lot more work to do. So anyway.
Yeah. Another question here. We already covered this one a little bit. Another question, given that many small enterprises are unlikely, nope, we already covered that one. Same, that's also about Glyph. Last question here. Can common trust attributes associated with identities such as credit score, licensing and certifications, bonding and insurance be exposed to called parties and terminating service providers while still preserving privacy?
Wow.
Yes, the answer is yes.
Yes.
And that goes back to the answer is yes. And the way that you do that is that you, I think that's a leading question. I didn't see it. I wonder who asked it, but it's one of the things that we talk about in some of the things that we talk about in looking at alternate ways to capture identity information. So the Glyph database that we talked about earlier, they have two ways of making the information available. I'll say there's two ways. It's not a good answer, but I'll say that anyway. There's two ways to present the information. One is that you have a legal entity identifier and that information is able to be looked up on a public database. The other one is that there's a verifiable legal entity identifier, and that was also pointed to in one of the comments that came in on the questions. And the difference between those is that the verifiable legal entity identifier, I mean, they're both verifiable, but the one that's called a VLEI is a cryptographically signed piece of information that belongs to the entity, and so they've signed it. so they're the ones signing it, but they also are used with, I should be careful on this because I haven't studied enough to say it correctly, but I'm going to say that the concept here is that you can have a trust attribute that has been signed by the owner of the attribute as well as by the issuer of the attribute. And that's actually what happens in X509 security certificates for what are used for delegate certificates. It's a certificate that you have, it was signed by the issuer and it was signed by you. And so it's a very similar concept. But if you study public key infrastructure and you look at certificate structures, based on what I've been reading, something that's uncommon to see is an attribute certificate. I don't even know if there's a working example of it, maybe inside of some company somewhere, but I haven't, and this maybe pop up some stuff here on the thing to educate me. I'm not familiar with any attribute certificates that are used in public key infrastructure, but it's the same concept that you can have an issuer, a holder, and that the information's been verified and then it's been cryptographically signed. So what you can do is you can get a signature from somebody that says, I am trustworthy. I have had eyes on the fact that this person is bonded and insured and that you can trust that information. And a perfect example of where that might come from is a lot of call centers have to be, I don't know if it's licensed the right word, Frank will be able to educate me here, but they do have to be bonded in a lot of states. And that bonding information is available to the state regulator. So the state regulator could say, this caller has been bonded. Now, they didn't have to expose the bond, don't have any information, you don't know who the bond issuer is, but there was some privacy protected there and having that trust attribute made available. Frank, I think you want to say something about this.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting use case because Florida, through their mini TCPA, it put a lot of restrictions on who can do telemarketing within it. And we went through the process to get certified as a legitimate telemarketer within Florida. This would be a perfect use case where you could say, hey, look, we are legitimately allowed to make this phone call, which then eliminates downstream complaints, because if someone puts a complaint in on a call, it's easily understood that that was already a legitimate call. And each state does have their own certifications and regulations that you have to file for. I think bonding would be an extreme definition, but you're correct. So as a telemarketer, people know who you are. And if you can in fact say you are legitimate, that helps, I think, answer one of the other questions about robocalling. A terminating carrier can make a risk assessment based on credentials sent by the initiating party. Do you have, what do you have? What are you presenting? And, do you deem it to be acceptable?
And depending on how you do it, that information is available before the call is ever placed, and the reputation can be established and used immediately without having to wait to download a certificate and look at a bunch of chains. Awesome. That's my final thought, Sarah.
All right, we're out of time. This has been awesome. Thanks, guys, for letting me.
Oh, go ahead, Frank. Or I think, Mark, we've left you with 1 minute to close out.
Thanks, Sarah. Are you guys done with comments?
Yeah, we had one more question on here, but we can cover that offline because I know you got to close out. Okay,
appreciate that. Sarah, Pierce, Frank, I want to thank you. This has been a great closing session for our event. And I want to make clear, I'm not saying that because Numerical is a platinum sponsor of the summit. I'm really serious. This is
I appreciate it.
The ideal capstone session, for our enterprise-focused Stir Shaken Summit this time around. And I want to thank also all of the attendees for sticking with us this entire week. There's been a lot of webinars, a lot of content that's been covered. All of the recordings are available for those, that want to rewatch any of the webinars or catch up, watch ones they missed. They're all going to be up on this, links on the agenda page for the event in perpetuity. We're not going to, delete them. Also, I know it's a little early probably for folks to have martinis at this point, but I know what I'm going to do when I sign off.
5 o'clock somewhere.
And also want to let folks know that we're going to be making decisions regarding our next event, which is going to be SIPNOC 2023. Some point in the near future. So we'll be making announcements about that, whether it's going to be live, whether it's going to be virtual again. We'll be making a determination about that pretty soon. So once again, thank you guys so much, and hope to see you the next event.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Bye all. Have a great weekend.
You too.